Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm speaking to a campaigner who came to prominence as the individual who broke the silence surrounding the misconduct of Harvey Weinstein. Formerly an assistant to Weinstein, Zelda Perkins made headlines when she came forward with allegations of sexual harassment against him. In the late 1990s, she signed the Non-Disclosure Agreement, or NDA, as part of a settlement which for years prevented her from speaking out about her experiences. However, motivated by the emergence of other allegations against Weinstein and the rise of the MeToo movement, Zelda chose to break her silence and speak publicly about her experiences and the culture of secrecy enabled by NDAs. Her story has been pivotal in the global discussion about sexual harassment in the workplace, the misuse of power, and the legal and ethical implications of non-disclosure agreements. Zelda is the co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence, a campaign group that is committed to end the misuse of NDAs to buy victims' silence. In our discussion, we talk about Zelda's experiences, what motivated her to break the NDA, what drives her campaigning, and what it's like being at the heart of a major global news story. You'll hear about the stresses and strains and her experience of something that nothing in life can really prepare you for. It's one of the most revealing discussions I've ever had on this show, with insights that are relevant to whistleblowing, transparency, campaigning, and the way organisations and society treats those who dare to speak up about injustice or wrongdoing. Zelda is an absolute force of nature, passionate about what she's doing, and inspirational in her approach. Stand by to be amazed, inspired, and informed. It's my discussion with Zelda Perkins on Can't Buy My Silence. Zelda, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm so excited because you're just an amazing person with an incredible story to tell. So I guess to start us off, obviously what happened to you is well known, but I'm intrigued about what was it that got you to a point where you felt like you wanted to do something? What's the tipping point there?
In 2017, I had tried to speak up a couple of years earlier, 3 years earlier, in fact. And I had tried to speak up once before, and it always was quashed, and there was nowhere for it to go. Every time I tried to speak up, basically what was reaffirmed was what I learned in 98 when I first tried to report Harvey's behavior, was that nobody wanted to know. And in fact, I was the one who was doing the wrong thing by speaking up. And so it was pretty upsetting. I think in 2013, 2014, when I tried again and I was, the journalists wanted to come out, but the rest of the system really doesn't. And ultimately it just drew into very, very stark relief the fact that you can buy justice and that it's about power and money. And I had hoped, I think, that things had moved on since 1998. In 1998, when I spoke up first about Harvey's behavior, I was only 24. I really had no power. I wasn't even thinking about it in those terms. I just was rather naively doing what I thought was right. I thought it was a binary situation. I thought if somebody sexually assaulted one of their employees, then there was only one way that would go. That was my naivety. And I think I had hoped the same when I spoke to a journalist. I spoke to Ken Arletta from the New Yorker in 2013, and he attempted to print the story, but it was shut down. So in 2017, when the New York Times journalists approached me, I think at that time, the truth is when Jodie Cantor first rang me, I was in a really bad mood. And these things always rely on a pinch of luck, a pinch of timing, a pinch of what's going on at that very second in your life, and then the bigger picture things. But when Jodie rang me, who was the journalist from the New York Times, and she was part of the pair that broke the story eventually, and she rang me in the July of 2017, the first thing she did was she didn't ask me any questions. She was also the first female journalist that had ever approached me. And I think that made a big difference, thinking back on it, really big difference. And she said, I'm not ringing to ask you about Harvey. I'm ringing to tell you some stuff that I know. And she told me some things that made me realize that the right people were talking. People in power were talking, not just people who would be perceived as sort of powerless victims. And I thought, okay, you know, I can't, I was just, and like I said, I was in a really bad mood. And I was like, genuinely was just kind of like, oh, but, bugger it. I'm not holding on to this any longer. This is ridiculous. If these people are now beginning to speak and movie stars are beginning to speak, there is a chance that people will listen. And so so I started speaking to her. And in terms of breaking my non-disclosure agreement, I said to her right from the beginning, I'm really happy to tell you everything, but to put it on the record, I would need a couple of other people to break their non-disclosure agreement, because he's not going to legally come after a group of us, but he would he'd come after me. And interestingly, when the New York Times first printed their story, they didn't use a huge amount of information that I'd given them. And I remember Jodie ringing me just before they pressed print, and she read me all the bits that I was involved in to make sure that I was happy. And I was really cross. Again, I sound like I'm always really cross. I was really cross. I was like, why didn't you use half the information I gave you? This isn't gonna go anywhere. This isn't gonna do anything. This article's pathetic. And then, when I read the book, I was like, poor Jodie and Megan, they'd be like fighting for their lives for months, months, months to get this article across the line. And they were so scared and proud and excited. And she rang me and I'm like, this is rubbish. Nothing's going to happen. Little did we know. So the reason that she didn't use a lot of the stuff that I'd given, it was because they were legally trying to protect me. And so ultimately for me, that first story wasn't very effective. It was very effective in bringing to light Harvey's horrific behavior, but to me, it was a very narrow story. And the moment that story came out, I actually then went and looked for the lawyers that had made the non-disclosure agreement between myself and Harvey Weinstein back in 1998 to find out if there was a legal loophole for me to break the NDA fully or not. I just wanted to find out what the situation was. And this really was my breaking point, because when I went to the lawyer, who I hadn't seen since 98, first of all, he didn't remember the case. When I rang him up, he didn't remember the case. And I was like, well, I better
Wow.
look in your files. And he said, oh, we had a warehouse fire. All our stuff burned down. And I was like, you know what? And he was really offhand. And I was like, you know what? I think you need to really check before you say all this stuff. Anyway, he rang me back about 3 hours later and he was like, oh, yeah, funnily enough, I did find your file in our safe with a post-it note on it saying, this file must not grow legs. And he said, you can come in and see me in a couple of weeks. I was like, no, I'm not coming in a couple of weeks. I'm coming in tomorrow to see you because we need to have a discussion. He said, I don't have time. I said, I don't care. I'm coming to the office tomorrow. I don't think you understand what's happening, because the New York Times story had only been out for a few days. So that huge sort of tsunami hadn't really it was beginning. It was sort of rumbling across the ocean. And I went and saw him, and he was exactly as I remembered him from 98, rather patronizing. Said, I don't understand why you're trying to do this. Harvey's going to go down now. So what's the point of you, taking any risks? And I was like, because it's not about Harvey. It's about the fact that the system has enabled Harvey for the last 24 years. We made an agreement that should have stopped his behavior. So the real problem here is the system. The real problem is this agreement, these agreements. And he didn't really agree with me. And I said, well, I need to take this to another lawyer. I need someone else to look at it. 'Cause he said, you can't break it. And then he told me that I couldn't. I mean, I knew I wasn't allowed to hold a copy of it. So I didn't actually have a copy of my own non-disclosure agreement.
Which is just absurd as a concept. I mean, how are you supposed to stick to something you haven't got
Not
a
only
copy
is
of?
it absurd, it's also illegal. And yet in 98, when that agreement was negotiated and made, I had counsel from Doughty Street Chambers. I had very good representation. And yet that was still allowed. Too young, a 24 and a 23-year-old girl. Our lawyers didn't think to say to us, we're not going to let that happen because it's unethical and basically illegal. But when I said, well, I'd like to get a second opinion, he said, well, I'm afraid you can't, because we signed a professional undertaking, which means that nobody else can look at this agreement without getting permission from Harvey Weinstein himself. So you're in this sort of Kafkaesque where I'm like, okay, so I'm still basically under his power. I'm still being, silenced on a daily basis. And I don't even have the power to find out if that is upholdable legally. And I think that was the thing that started to flick the switch. And so I started calling other lawyers, big firms, big, nasty, mean firms who I thought would really want to get into this and fight. And I got completely stonewalled, which I guess, again, and there's some parts of me that's clearly really naive. I just couldn't believe this. And I had a friend who happened to work for quite a big law firm, and he very kindly and very naughtily sent me the internal email he had received about my request. And in that email, it said, do not touch this woman with a barge pole because she is calling into question the enforceability of the agreements we make with all our high net worth individual clients and, big corporate clients. And that was the thing that absolutely blew me then. I was like, okay, this, not only am I right, this is about the system, it's bigger than Harvey, but this genuinely, this is not about me, it's not about this agreement, it is everywhere. And the fact that the legal profession understands that it's doing something wrong, because that email showed me that they understood that they were doing something slightly wrong. And so at that point, I was like, I break my agreement and I don't care what happens, because this is a stitch up.
Wow. So this is, I'm guessing this is, it's bubbling under. You kind of know you want to do something with this for time. And then there's this trigger point, and I guess suddenly you just find yourself in a position where you want to fix this, right? This becomes, you've got to do this, right? So I'm really sensing the way you're talking about it. This is not sensible decision making in the, all the sensible advice would be, but stay clear of this. This is a dangerous thing to do. You're like, I am
Yeah.
not going to let this go because this is personal, but it's also, this is just a bigger thing. This is your mission.
Well, it wasn't a mission, but I think I felt at that point, I felt I had a moral duty with regard to Harvey's behavior, absolutely, to call this out. But even more, I felt I had a moral duty to expose systemic failure, because that's way more dangerous. That's way more dangerous because that affects everybody. And I think when it became very clear to me that this wasn't just one weak man who was being facilitated by our sort of cultural sycophancy to celebrity and power, but it was bigger than that. This was, in my mind, the law, the British legal system was this great pillar of justice and right. And I'd been brought up by my grandparents who were military. So I had a lot of time to the establishment and a lot of belief, not time, I had a lot of belief. It had been hardwired into me that the pillars of our society were unimpeachable, which I'm sure lots of people will laugh at, but certainly at 23, 24, when this first happened to me, that's what I really believed. And that's why the whole process of negotiating the NDA was so morally destructive and completely crushed me. Harvey's behavior shocked me, made me angry, repulsed me. But what broke me was the legal process. And then I disappeared for 20 years. I went and lived in Guatemala. And so when the opportunity to, or when it was shown to me very clearly again that this was a systemic problem. So when I actually re-engaged again with the legal issue around the Harvey story, that was what really sent me wild. And yes, there was no rational decision making. It was a knee-jerk reaction. And in fact, I didn't speak to very many people about it. And a couple of friends of mine who were lawyers or had legal knowledge, the first words out of their mouth was, don't go anywhere near this, don't do this. And so like all sensible people, I just didn't talk to them anymore. But I think there are certain times in your life, for better or worse, where you can't ignore your inner drive to do something. And it's kind of your heart. It's your heart over your head. And this was definitely, it was heart and head, but I kind of, I lost my ability to care or think about risk at that point, because it was just more important that I purged this And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I'd been sitting on it for 23 years. And suddenly, once that valve was hit, there wasn't anything that was going to stop me. Because, when I then spoke to the FT and I did a full NDA break in the FT, which was a week after the New York Times story, I asked them, obviously, if they would be able to protect me. And they were like, no, there's nothing we can do legally. We won't be able to protect you, but there will be the court of public opinion. And I remember thinking, oh, well, if I do get sent to jail and I do get sued for hundreds of thousands of dollars, surely the public will be able to see and right will come. And if I have to sit in jail for a bit and I have to start a crowdfunder, so what? I mean, that was literally, and that was a 2-minute thought. And I felt that my need to break this issue into the public domain was way stronger than my concern about potentially at that time, which I thought could happen. Maybe I'd go to jail and get sued.
And I find it fascinating because it's very clear when you talk that this is driven, as you rightly point out, from within. And you're just saying, I have to do this. And I think it's interesting because you're in a position where you've got the ability to do it. So you're articulate, you have the understanding of the system, you've had time to think about this. So you're in a relatively strong position to do this. And yet it's a big ask, right? It's a big, when you sort of step back and think of what you're taking on here, that feels like a huge thing. And so as you talk about this as a broader mission, I'm thinking it's difficult for somebody with a lot of the skills that you would want to have to be able to do this, to do it, let alone people that just don't have that.
And I think that was very much another driver too for me. And right, even from the beginning, I remember back in 98 thinking I'm a white, middle class, well educated, well connected 23-year-old, and I couldn't do a thing. I mean, you could look at it the other way and go, well, I was only 23 and all of those things. But actually, I had a lot of privilege on my side, and I literally couldn't do a thing. All I had, I guess, were the things that you've just said, that I was articulate. This time round, even though I didn't feel like it, again, I'm white, middle class, financially stable, much better connected. I didn't know, I hadn't had time to really think about the system. I didn't understand the system. I will take your very kind compliment that I'm articulate. Only because so many boyfriends have told me they don't like arguing with me. So I guess it is true. I've heard it on many, many poor boyfriends. But I was going into it not feeling like I had any weapons, or I didn't even really feel like I needed any because I didn't understand what I was doing, to be honest. The truth is I didn't understand what I was doing, but I did understand that I did have those things, that I was privileged and capable to, speak up. And this then grew. It wasn't right at that first moment, but certainly once I started speaking to other people who'd signed NDAs and getting more into this world of sort of whistleblowing, I really discovered, and it made me feel very passionately about carrying this on, was that even with all of the skills I had and all of the privilege that I had, this was an incredibly difficult thing to do. And if I couldn't do it, then who's going to who's going to help people who don't have any of the advantages that I had?
And so you've accepted, I guess, implicitly in your actions and the drivers, you've just accepted that mantle of, and I used the term mission before. Clearly, you start with just, I think this is what I want to do, and this feels like the right thing to do. And then, as you say, then it starts to become your mission, and you just accept that mantle. And this has become, is it an exaggeration to say this is your life's purpose now in some respects from where you're sat?
Well, it's funny. It's gone through so many different cycles. And I think, I'm now looking at something that's been going on for nearly 7 years, which makes me feel quite faint when I think about that. I mean, I was 45 when I broke the NDA in 2017. And I would say the first 18 months of that mission was entirely, well, it was more personal because it was dealing with my personal experience. And I had to go through there was a lot surrounding the Weinstein case. So I was going through a police investigation. I was going through legal investigation. I was going through regulators investigation. I was giving evidence at select committee to, different select committee inquiries. And it was all very much focused on my specific non-disclosure agreement, my specific experience. And at that time, it was very much being pulled into the sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, MeToo field. And I kept sort of saying over and over and over again, I'm not a MeToo person. Not that I was trying to distance myself from it. I just felt that there were so many voices speaking up about that, which was really important. But what I was trying to do was broaden the focus, say this isn't just a gender thing. This is about the abuse of power. And it is not about an individual thing. It is about the system enables those in power to abuse those who are more vulnerable or who are in need of them. So if you're an employee, you need your employer because he's paying your bills or she's paying your bills. They are the absolute source of your livelihood. And that power dynamic is huge. And it's not just about sexual harassment. The Harvey story caught everybody's imaginations because there were movie stars and it was sex and it was salacious and Harvey was gross to look at and he made this perfect ogre. And, if we wanted to talk about this from the kind of film industry and Hollywood angle, for me, it was also very important that everybody didn't just get away with the fact that they were all going, oh, look at Harvey, he's the baddie, don't look over here, don't look over here, which is what everyone was doing. They all jumped on the bandwagon, but they were all at it too. And again, that's about the system. It's because the system enabled them all to behave like that. So what I wanted was everybody to take a bigger collective responsibility about what we've had. I mean, it sounds terribly grand. I wasn't sitting at home going, oh, yes, I want everyone to take a big responsibility, responsibility. It grew. It started off as my own issue, which I had to publicly, legally, criminally go through. And that was a very intense period of time that took 18 months. And I didn't really have much choice or control of. I was just being tumbled in this huge wave of media attention, police attention, legal attention, and just trying to keep very focused on what I was trying to achieve in terms of making sure that people understood that non-disclosure agreements and the legal system needed to be reformed. I didn't think it was going to have anything to do with me. I just wanted to tell the right people. So it was the same as in 98. I was acting like this fool girl. I was like, I'm going to tell the teachers, then they'll take over and deal with it.
So the adults will solve this problem. I just have to tell them what's going on. Of course, and you're the adult that has to deal with it.
But I didn't understand that. And I actually think, for me, it was a big learning curve for me, was understanding I had been really the 23 years that I'd been silenced. I was kind of entrapped, retarded into that 23-year-old's psyche. I never had really moved on from that. And I didn't really realize it until I reached this point 23 years later, because everyone looking at me saw this middle-aged woman who was perfectly capable of leading a fight. I still felt like a 23-year-old young woman at the beginning of things who didn't have the intelligence, the knowledge, the experience, the ability to do anything. I just wanted to tell people, wanted to tell the grown-ups, and they would fix it. And it took me quite a long time, I think, to realize that I was this middle-aged woman and everyone was looking at me and going, yeah, this is brilliant. Yeah, keep going. And I'm like, no, here, take it. And it kept being thrown back at me and I didn't really understand. I genuinely, it was this very weird, it was sort of like a dysmorphia. I couldn't understand. I could go into meetings with grown-ups and they actually listened to me and took me seriously. And I would say it took me a good 2 years to not feel apologetic about being in those rooms.
And it's interesting because nothing can prepare you for this, right? Well, this wasn't ever your, because I'm always struck. There are some people that seek out fame. Even they are surprised by what the reality feels like. But you haven't asked for any of this. This has just come along. And so you're having to, I guess in the nicest possible way, sort of make it up as you go along, right? You're discovering things. It's on the job training, as it were.
And I haven't got a clue what I'm doing, Christian. I never had. Everything is by mistake. I've always said, now I'm an accidental campaigner. I didn't mean to do this. As I say, I just thought I was pointing something out and I would move on. And I was desperately doggy paddling as fast as I could into all these situations. And you said, because actually, if you're looking for fame and you're looking for recognition, you'll not make a very good whistleblower. And you will be consumed by it. And you will end up, I think, failing because you fall into the same trap. You fall into the trap that you're pushing against, which is our human behavior around power. And if you start indulging in the power that you get given when you're given a voice, or when you fight for that voice and you have the ability to be listened to, if you then, settle in onto your laurels and think that you've done the job and that everyone's always going to applaud you. Everyone applauds you at the beginning because they think it's brave. And I think it's very difficult and it's very intoxicating for lots of people for that to happen. I found it absolutely horrifying and terrifying. And I think partly because this had been such a long process and I had been essentially so shut down by that NDA that I wasn't in my body, I wasn't in myself. And it took me such a long time to even accept that I was being heard. Whereas, I've seen it happen to lots of other people, particularly in the Weinstein thing, where they've been under this huge pressure and this awful negative thing has happened to them. They're terrified of coming forward. They don't want to be defined as a sexual assault victim. They think it's all going to be awful. They speak up and they suddenly get this rush of relief, of validation. Everyone's terribly nice to you. But then you see what happens to some people, that they end up clinging on to the wrong thing. And the wrong thing is getting positive feedback from the press, from people around you. But what you have to always remember is every single person has an agenda. And that doesn't mean they're evil or bad, but everybody has an agenda. And that agenda is not your welfare. And I think that's something that kept me very sane, was that I knew that every person, for right or wrong, had an agenda. And I would obsess about every single newspaper or journalist or lawyer or friend or anybody that I spoke to about anything, and try and work out what their subconscious or conscious agenda was.
I mean, that's got to be exhausting.
Yeah.
I mean, what I sense with you, sort of there's two threads here, and I recognize this is not that simple, but there's a tremendous energy and passion and a desire to get the outcome that you're looking for. But there's also, must be exhausting, because this is presumably all consuming. You can't, can you shut this out? I mean, how are your emotions at this time? Must be really mixed emotions, challenging. How was it?
Well, again, I think for everybody, it's a very different thing. Mine was fairly extreme. I mean, not the most extreme. I know other whistleblowers and people who've spoken up have had worse. But, I had press camped outside my house for 2 or 3 months. I wasn't, I have family, but I hadn't spoken to my family about this. And I was in this weird, wild storm of my own, really. And actually, there's quite a funny story. And actually, it's a very telling story of emotionally, I think, what was going on that I wasn't really aware of. But after about, I think it was probably 12 months, and this is a shed out. I have a shed out in the garden, and this is where I would come in, and I'd be working and dealing with all of the stuff that was going on. About a year into the process, I think it was maybe after Harvey had gone to jail. I can't really remember, but there was a point where I remember coming into here and being like, "Oh, where is everybody?" I was really confused. I was like, "Where is everybody? It's really quiet. What's going on?" And then I realized that my head had been so loud. There had been so much going on in my head. And this was the first lull in 12 months, 18 months. It was the first lull I had had. And it was really odd because in my head, it had been like I had been in this huge war room with hundreds of people with me. Everybody going, well, hell, I know, Prince, then do this, call that, do this. Blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, I was like, and I genuinely was quite worried. I was like, oh my God, maybe I've gone completely insane because it was the first time that all that noise had gone from my head. And I was like, oh, I don't know what to do now. And I think that first 12, 18 months, I was in full fight, fight mode. So it was just, I had so much adrenaline coursing in my body all the time. And actually 4 months later, I did go to the doctor because I was really struggling. And actually it wasn't 4 months later. It was longer than that. But I went to the doctor because I was really struggling and they did my blood tests and I had adrenal failure. And that kind of makes total sense because I had spent 18 months, 2 years running at the height of my adrenaline.
But you've pushed the system to the
Yeah,
max, right?
and
Because to get through this.
it wasn't like I suddenly had a breakdown. It wasn't like an emotional breakdown. It was just literally physically, my body I couldn't produce enough chemicals. I couldn't produce the adrenaline to make that noise in my head. And it made me realize I mean, I knew it had been intense, but it just made me realize when you get a physical manifestation. And what's interesting is that that is not unusual. When I started speaking to people who had NDAs, and so these aren't whistleblowers, these are people who had NDAs and were still being held under these NDAs. One of the most common things that kept coming up was nearly all of them about a year or 2 years into the process of having been silenced. Most of them had some form of mental health crisis, but nearly all of them also had massive physical crises. Their bodies manifested the stress that they had been under. And I think people still get a bit icky around mental health. Certainly the older generation. I know now, everybody talks about mental health openly, but I still think that older generations still think it's all a bit woo-woo or it's a weakness. But if you have a physical illness, if you display physical breakdown, then people take that really seriously. And what's so extraordinary is a lot of the people, the physical manifestations of the stress and abuse that they felt that they were suffering being silenced often became things like they genuinely lost their voices, they had eyesight problems, all sorts of different things. But people had catastrophic physical illnesses that came from the stress of being continually silenced and not being able to speak the truth to even necessarily their friends and family, because a lot of NDAs do stop you from being able to speak to anybody. In my case, I wasn't allowed to speak to a doctor, a priest, a policeman, anybody. Which is not enforceable, but I didn't know that.
So really, when you're looking at this, I mean, this goes way beyond just, things aren't being aired that should be aired and bad behaviors are being protected. You're actually also saying, well, anybody that is subject to a particular extreme form of NDA, that's in many cases, the reason they're subject to it is something has gone on or they've been in situations where there are secrets there. So they've been under stress already. And, your case is a good example. And this then just continues. And so there's a huge part of this, I guess, is recognizing the damage this is doing, not just to society where things that should be aired aren't being aired, but actually to individuals.
Absolutely. And I think, again, in terms of the cycles, I was talking about in terms of this being a mission or not. In that first year, I was part of a government department investigation into NDAs, and they had these round tables and they brought in lots of people, different people who signed NDAs. And, again, I'd been stuck in my own little war, which was very much about Harvey at the time, but my focus was always the legal element of it. And this was Bain, so this was when, what's now Business and Trade, Department of Business and Trade. And in this investigation, there was someone from the charity sector, someone from the financial sector, someone from the civil service, someone from education, someone from tech. There was somebody pretty much from every sector that you could imagine. Some of them had been earning or were earning lots and lots of money. Some of them weren't at all. Someone from hospitality. But what was so shocking was all of their stories were the same. And essentially, they were all really good people because they're the people who stand up and say something's wrong. And these are the people who you should be valuing the most in your company because these are the people with strong ethics, strong, work ethic, strong moral ethic, and care about their colleagues. And yet these are the people that are red flag people to most companies. And this is where, I always use I always say, we're just looking the wrong way down the telescope. You just need to turn the telescope around and it's not so scary. But all of these people who essentially are good employees call something out, end up going through this terrifyingly aggressive negotiation period to settle, to get them out, where they also get silenced, where they are told that to get their settlement, they have to agree to confidentiality, which, by the way, is absolute bullshit. Those two things are not wary. They're not connected. They've become connected and they've become standardized in the legal profession's mind and in employers' mind. But a settlement agreement is a perfectly reasonable and necessary agreement between two parties, right? And they can't agree. They can't agree over a dispute, but neither of them want to take it to tribunal or further legally. So you agree to settle. That money is compensation for the damages that that person has suffered, or it's compensation for the time of work that they're going to lose, getting a new job. It is not payment for confidentiality. And any lawyer that tells you that that payment is for confidentiality is wrong, and you should be reporting them to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority.
And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that is exactly how it's perceived, right? It's presented as this. You sort of it's hush money. You get this, and then we don't talk about this ever again, and everything's fine, right? And we don't need to
Move
acknowledge that
on.
what's
Yeah,
happened
everyone
is
will
bad.
be fine. And the awful thing is, and that's what I discovered at this big round table, is that every single person in that room not only suffered mentally, which I kind of expected, but pretty catastrophically, but they all also became physically ill. A big percentage of them lost their most intimate relationship. So relationship with their partner broke down, relationships with their children broke down. Because what you don't realize when you're signing something like that, you don't actually understand the ripple effect and the consequences, the implications of not being able to speak about something. When you can't speak about something, you can't explain to somebody why maybe you're suddenly, you know, having a bit of an emotional and psychological struggle and breakdown. You can't explain to a new prospective employer, why you left your last company. And when it's something bad that happened to you, that's really hard. You also start to then potentially struggle with the fact that by not saying what's happened, you realize that you're leaving a whole lot of other people at risk. So you're actually complicit in potential abuse. And all of these things start to slowly build because at the time you're put under pressure. The lawyers are like, come on, sign. You've got to make up your mind by this evening. If you don't sign this evening, the deal's off the table. It's warfare, it's threat. And actually, I don't think that you shouldn't be allowed to negotiate like that in those situations. But it's private contract law. We all have a right to make a private contract. That's what lawyers will argue with you. They're like, look, it's fair for people to be able to make a private contract. I personally don't think that law being private means that it's immoral or unethical. It should still be held to the same moral, ethical standard that a court holds it in. As a lawyer, you are an officer of the court. Your first duty is to the court. It's to justice. It's not to whoever's paying your bill. And that's again where the rub comes. And that's why I've gone after the regulators so much. Because I'm like, the lawyers have gone off peak. They don't really realize it. It's not their fault. They're getting a big pat on the back and being paid a big amount of money because they've aggressively negotiated a deal and kicked somebody problematic out. But that's not what their job is.
As I think about other situations that we might find ourselves in as individuals, where we don't know what we're doing. So taking out a mortgage, for example, we're not mortgage experts. And so we get help from that, right? And we have cooling off periods for things like insurance policies because we recognize that actually, if you haven't ever done something before, you do it infrequently, and you're up against somebody that does this the whole time, banks and insurance companies, that you need some form of protection. And so what I think is interesting about what you've described here is that not only do those same dynamics apply, right? We're not all serial signers of NDAs, and the people that have gone in to sign them, typically as in your case, is not somebody that you wouldn't have planned to be in that position. So even if you could have prepared yourself, you're not ever sort of sitting there thinking, I must learn, must read up on these things just in case I have to sign one day. But the second thing is the people on the other side of the table, the lawyers also probably have never signed one in a personal capacity either. So there's a lot of ignorance around what does this actually mean. And so when you talk about it, if we just remove the context and we said we've got a load of people here who don't really understand the psychological implications or the decision-making processes that are going on or the pressures on people, then we ought to step in and protect for that, let alone when we start to think about the context.
Exactly. And, looking at it in that very basic, clear way is what the select committee inquiries and the Bayes consultation essentially did. And they said, oh, well, so as long as somebody has got, independent legal advice, so there's the person helping you. And maybe these agreements should be in plain English because legalese is impossible to, most average person. And you can't have these agreements saying that you're not allowed to report to the authorities. Now, these things are all basic things that you'd think would be in place anyway. But what I was trying to, and I'm still trying to make clear, and why I don't believe, and all of these recommendations basically are making a safer environment to create NDAs, making better NDAs. And I think at the beginning, I was like, yeah, maybe this is the way to go. But the more I've learned, the more people I've spoken to, the more Pandora's box has poured out to myself and to the co-founder of the campaign that I now run, Can't Buy My Silence, who's a law professor called Julia McFarlane and is based in Canada. And, her work all happens really in Canada. What's so shocking and very clear is that's not the way to solve it. There aren't better NDAs. There aren't okay NDAs. If you report how many NDAs are signed in a company, that's not going to stop the problem. Actually, you have to just stick to the root. The root is non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality agreements were made to protect IP and trade secrets, client confidentiality. That's fine. They are appropriate. They have a place. They were not made to hide anything that anybody wants, which in the case of what we broadly call NDAs tends to be harm, whether that is flammable cladding, poor building materials, or whether it's a sex pest at work, or whether it's, a bad surgeon. That is not the place for a legally enforceable agreement to be being used as a tool. That is unethical and wrong. So to uphold that kind of ethical principles of law, to me, it's not just about legislative change, it is about regulatory change. And there I have a very big fight because the regulators have done they thought was enough, which is they've put out endless warning notices. So, for instance, the SRA put out 5 warning notices since I broke my NDA about lawyers and what's ethical and not ethical. However, last year they did a study into the use of NDAs because I'm still banging on. They're getting quite bored of me banging on. And guess what did they find? They found that not only is there a problem, which I'd have thought was quite clear by now, but they've got to do this systematically, properly. But they also found out that only 30% of their members were even aware of the warning notices that they've been putting out over the last 5 years. Now, in that very first meeting that I had with the Assistant Regulatory Authority when they were investigating my NDA, I said to them, can you not change the rules? Because your lawyers haven't done anything wrong legally. So you need to change guidance so that they know that they can't do this. And they said, no, we're trying to make guidance less prescriptive, not more prescriptive. Well, I'm sorry that we're now 5 years, 6 years, 7 years down the line. and lawyers still are doing the same thing. I have people coming to me who are being put under coercive, terribly intimidating, into situations. Last year I had a woman who was in hospital where she was there because it was her second attempt on her life because the negotiation process was so upsetting. And the lawyers brought the agreement into hospital for her to sign and said, we've added a clause that in the event of your death, the money will go to your parents, your family, but so will as will the confidentiality provisions. Now, if you tell me
What?
any way that that is ethical or moral, so that clearly shows, warning notices aren't enough. There needs to be very clear guidance about where you can use confidentiality provisions correctly, and they're not in these cases.
Wow. And I mean, it's astonishing if, and I'll take a very simplistic analysis here. If we thought about other things that are harmful to people or harmful to society, we act. Right? It may take a bit of time, but I think this is really interesting the way you talk about, well, there's this sort of, we have to have, let's protect the construct and make it a little bit better. And we'll fire some warning shots. And it's so, from the way you talk about it, it's so ingrained in, legal thinking and process that you're right. It's when you put it in those terms, we do need something a bit more radical. I mean, it's obvious that sort of nudging people along because ultimately these things make life from the perspective of organizations. It's much easier if we can hush these things up. Never have to talk about them again. Let's make the problem go away. And of course, so you can see the temptation in there. And because it's become so ingrained, so embedded, and what I think is interesting is lots of people have heard of the term NDA. Even if you haven't signed one, you're probably aware that they exist as concepts. So this thing is sort of broadly understood. But you're right. It seems to me odd that we're tinkering around the edges, and that I guess that's why you're so vociferous in what you're saying because it's not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I thought in that first 18 months when Theresa May was PM, she said that she was going to stop this. Unfortunately, we had a leadership change, and we got somebody who I think relies quite heavily on obfuscation and confidentiality in all areas of his life.
Who has a massive conflict of interest on this subject? I would
Massive
argue.
conflict of interest. And so all the work that our taxpayers' money went towards paying for these select committee inquiries to the Bay, consultation, all got ignored, gets chucked down to the bottom of the pile. When you've got when you've got new cabinet, then everything changes. And then we had COVID. But, at that time in 2018, 19, I genuinely thought that this was going to move very quickly. And it felt like it wasn't such a big ask. And I think, again, when you talk about the mission element of this, I thought it would all be done and dusted by the end of 2019. If I had known that I would be dedicating the last 5 years, 6 years of my life to this, I'm not sure that I would have, I don't think I would have stepped off the plank. And I think the other thing is everybody's always fascinated by the firework moment, by the moment you break cover. And actually what I keep trying to say is, or not I keep trying to say, what I've discovered is that moment was the easy moment in a way. Breaking cover, whistleblowing, following my heart, my gut reaction to this, that wasn't difficult. But I can tell you that, particularly since I started the forward public facing campaign, Can't Buy My Silence, which has actually only been 2.5 years now, that has been the hard bit. Getting up every morning and self-motivating to keep pushing, the entire, you are pushing against the establishment, the status quo. And I am a one-man band. I don't have money. Nobody's paying me to do this. This is when it gets hard. And this is the part that I will take praise for. I won't take praise for whistleblowing. I won't take praise for going and shouting at Harvey when he attacked somebody. To me, that's normal behavior. What I'm doing now is abnormal behavior because I am having to drag myself out of bed every morning and keep fighting and keep energized and keep pushing and keep hitting a brick wall, but go, I know this is right and it's possible to change. That's the hard bit. So it's difficult because in many ways, this is the positive that has come out of the negative. I'm genuinely doing something positive, but it is also so hard. It is so hard. And what keeps me going is seeing the end of it. And I can't wait to reclaim my silence. I cannot wait to go back to that quiet place. But the problem is, and I think, this was something that you said when we very first got on the call, I can't wait to stop and get my life back. But I now have no idea what my life is. And that does scare me. And I just try not to think about it too much. I don't want to look down because as much admiration and hot air that is blown up my arse, I'm not being offered any jobs. Nobody offers me a salary. Nobody offers me payment to come and do anything. Nobody offers me money to speak. Nobody offers me money to advise the government, or politicians, or try and do what I'm doing with Labour at the moment. Nobody offers anything for that. Nobody offers support. And, so again, you're like, okay, well, everyone keeps telling you what you're doing is brilliant and marvelous and how great you are. But also I think people are very afraid of those of us who speak up. We're frightening people out on board because we're unreliable in a way because you run the risk of having somebody who's going to call stuff out. People don't really want disruptors on board. They love disruptors, but they don't really want them on board.
I think that's really interesting because I think I wouldn't have said that you were unreliable. I would have used the word unpredictable,
Yes.
which I think is,
Sorry.
for me, a slightly subtle
Yeah.
thing because I think you're incredibly reliable in the sense of like you're pursuing, I'll come back to the term I use, the mission, but people don't know what that might mean and where might you go with this. And I think one of the things that's absolutely incredible is that, as you say, everybody wants to take we'll have the benefit. This is great that you're doing this. This is excellent. But like, I'm a bit scared about how she might get there and what that means and that kind of and I think what's interesting for me is that when one steps back a bit and looks at it, of course you're gonna have to do these things, particularly given what you're up against. There aren't gonna be, a neatly codifiable set of things. Well, this is what Zelda will do, is what you are having to be, I'm guessing, opportunist here. And there will be things opportunities that open up, and you'll go, well, I'll do that. And you might not, because this isn't, you're not following a business model or a business plan or a predictable thing. It's like, it's almost whatever it takes, I guess, to make this happen. If there's an opportunity there, you're going to grab it.
Yeah, no, you're really perceptive about the experience because I always find it really difficult to explain to people because people don't really understand what I'm doing. And people are always like, so what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm campaigning. They're like, yeah, but what are you working at? And I'm like, well, I'm working at this, and it's all consuming. It's 24/7, and it's whatever it takes. And there's a wonderful freedom in not having anybody saying you can't do this, you can do this. This is the way to do it. This isn't the way to do it. But that's also the challenge of it is you're in the Wild West. And there is this weird thing, and you're right, it wasn't unreliable. Unreliable was wrong. It's unpredictable. And there's this funny thing is like, a lot of people say to me, oh my God, it's amazing that you get to go into all these meetings that, you email a CEO or you email the law commission or you email the bar council and the heads of all of these people will meet with you. And God, you must be so impressive. And I'm like, no, you know what? It's not that I'm so impressive at all. It's slightly to do with their fear. So all of those people, the only reason they get me in the room is they're just checking me out to see, it's a risk assessment. So they want to see how how risky it is. Do they want to pay me lip service? Do they need to be on the right side of my agenda? Or am I just, all hot air? Do I have influence? That's why they let me in the room, not necessarily because they want to make change and be good. And I realize, and I think again, it's that weird thing, like it's terrifying when these people take your meetings and say, yes, come in and meet me. Like it's the kind of the bare knuckle fighting bit where you write to these people being the disruptor going, yeah, meet me. Then when they say, yes, I'll meet you, you're like, oh shit. What am I going to actually say to them? Because it's just me. It's like me in my holy jumper and, my shoes, my trainers, which are falling apart, and no legal training, and no business training, and no corporate strategy understanding. And I've somehow got to go in there and make them either like me or fear me enough to help me. And, there is nothing you can do to train you for that. And sometimes it works and sometimes I fail miserably, and I think all you can ever hope for is to try and appeal to the good in people. And everybody has that in them. Everybody knows what's right. And it's about trying to refocus people on what's right rather than what the general system is and that you can't change it.
It's fascinating when you say that, because I think intuitively, undeniably, these things, and this doesn't take a great leap to work out. You don't have to be a lawyer to see how these things could go wrong.
Yeah.
And your story's one of well, I mean, question for you. I guess there must be thousands, hundreds of thousands. I mean, there's tons of these things out there, and so it doesn't take too much imagination to work that out. So you are at least fighting an undeniable battle, albeit that the vested interests in preserving the status quo, that's pretty obvious as well. There's money behind that. There's convenience behind that. It's almost what you've got here is it would be nicer and easier if you just shut up and went away. And you've demonstrated you're not going to do that. And so I think this is a sort of microcosm of the thing. So I guess on the one hand, it must be great because the case you're making is obvious. You're not having to argue. I don't know. If we took something like the climate, you could sort of, there are people that are capable of making arguments that the climate, the climate catastrophe isn't really happening. It's fine. Whereas this, if you honestly come to the table and think about it, everybody would accept that there are some bad outcomes here that we don't want. We would not want to be on the receiving end of this. And so that ought to make it easy. And yet you're ranged against these vested interests and these other emotional arguments and financial arguments as to why it shouldn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, and there is, there particularly for the legal fraternity, there is a big argument around the fact that, in an unproven case, you have to have confidentiality to protect the person who maybe has been, somebody's made up an allegation about. And that is the argument that it always comes back to. But again, I just try and simplify it because there's always going to be specific cases when there is a problem. But like, we don't not have a benefit system because some people choose it. And it's like, why would we have a legal agreement that basically protects a potential perpetrator rather than a victim? And statistically, there are more victims than there are perpetrators, yet the lawyers want to give the alleged perpetrators the same, if not better, protection than the potential victim. I'm like, but that just doesn't make sense. The only reason it makes sense is commercially. Now, the law isn't about that, is it? The law is meant to be about something slightly higher than that. But we have to acknowledge that everybody, we live in a capitalist society, so that money talks. And that the CEO of a company is more valuable than an employee, than a PA. And that's where the rub is very difficult. But to me, again, this is about being brave. This is just one uncomfortable period of time where we have to make a change. So that change is, right now, that's how it's worked. But you know what? You take that tool away, and yes, we'll go through a bit of a rough patch where we might lose some of the good CEOs, some of the best surgeons, some of these people. But essentially, once you remove that tool, people are going to self-regulate much more, because if you don't have the equipment to hide bad behavior, you have to regulate your own behavior. That's why we have law. That's what the police, like if you know there's a consequence, then you're not going to do it. If you know that you can hide it, well, then you'll take the risk. I'm like, why is that so complicated to understand?
It's such a great point. It comes down to the sort of the theme of the show, right? Is what's human behavior is driven by the incentives and the structures that are there. And so if we have things in place that we can point towards and say, this is likely to drive in certain circumstances bad behavior, we don't want that societally, then we need to step in and change that.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, it's very simple analysis, but I think what you're basically pulling out here is saying we have a structure in place that was, and we can be fair here and say, there was a legitimacy to, as you pointed out, to non-disclosure agreements, right, to protect intellectual property, and there's a benefit to that. This has now been abused. People have been clever and adapted and used it for a purpose for which it was not originally intended. So we need to recognize that and we need to do something about it. Because otherwise, the human behaviors that we get as a result of it are things that none of us would actually want in society if it impacted us. And we might think, well, it's actually beneficial to me. But if we looked at it and said, actually, does this help society as a whole? No.
And again, it's turning the telescope round, because actually companies look at NDAs as reputational protective, tools to protect their reputation. But if you look at it a bit more closely, they're not actually. And particularly now that the environment has changed in the last, the one amazing thing is that, the wave that I was surfing on, which was MeToo. And then, we've had Black Lives Matter, and we've had more and more transparency needs to be something that we operate under. What you're seeing is that actually the more you hide things, the more you push stuff down, the more damaging ultimately it's going to become. So if you're a company, now people are beginning to break their NDAs. I've had 4 people break their NDAs in the last 12 months. They've had no legal recriminations. Guess who has? The people who put them. So Crispin Odey. The reason Crispin Odey, so Odey Asset Management, Crispin Odey was a huge donor to the Conservative Party. He's the one who advised Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss to make that brilliant mini budget. I mean, great guy. He had been reported to the FCA over 3 years ago about his appalling sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior in Odey Asset Management. It had been reported on in the media a bit, but it wasn't until 2 women broke their NDAs in the FT. So it was in white collar language that was broken that validated what those women were saying, because obviously people saying it happened just were hysterical women. But once we had a white collar male construct that was broken, well, then they must have been saying the truth, because but once those NDAs were broken, suddenly everybody believed it. And, Odey Asset Management no longer exists. The head and the Manuel Cortez, the general secretary of the TSSA, which is one of the transport unions. Someone was very brave and broke her NDA around him. And the same thing happened. They tried to super injunct her, but actually the court, when I can't super injunct a woman who's speaking out about sexual harassment. And the TSSA realized that they were going to look worse if they tried to go after her. So this is the thing. If you want to protect your reputation, deal with it at the beginning. Don't have that behavior. That's how you protect your reputation, is you make people behave well at the start. You don't hide your shit. You don't make the shit. You're like, come on, I'm offering you a really good solution. And actually, the great thing is it creates more self-regulation. Whereas if you just create better NDAs, it becomes more complex, because you have to have all these processes, all these boxes you have to tick, all these different policies we have to report how many NDAs we have, or if there's 1 grievance, 2 grievances, 3 grievances about the same person, what do we do? It's like, just take it away. I'm shouting now. But
No, I love it. I love it, because what's amazing is you're making a really good point, and the passion that's just there, and it's and I love it because it's plain speaking. And often, a lot of the challenge here is it's shrouded in complexity and technical language and things we don't know about, and there's a fog around it, both around the underlying subject, but also the process. And your points about, you're sat in a room there and you're told things by lawyers. Well, of course, you're not a lawyer, so what are you to know? So this is all this. If we can create enough obfuscation and fog, then we solve the problem. And you're saying let's remove all of that and let's just shine. Let's say sunlight is a great disinfectant, right? Let's just shine light. And I think as you were talking, I was thinking there's so many other things going on at the moment. If I look at the post office scandal in the UK, that's again, there's this constant attempt to sort of keep things secret and make the problem go away. But ultimately, it isn't going to go
Yeah.
away. And so I love the core thrust of your argument is you can't hide this stuff, right? It is going to come out. And we've got more and more mechanisms for people to share that information. You know, the internet, social media can serve a useful purpose in some of these sorts of things. So it's almost there's an inevitability to what you're talking about. And so I love that. I think that the shouting and the passion is incredibly
Well,
important,
it
right? Because I think everybody intuitively recognizes what you're saying. It's just that some people have an interest in not recognizing it yet.
Yes. And I guess the reason I'm like, I started off saying it and I feel like I'm now shouting it because I have been saying exactly the same thing. It's not like my argument has become more sophisticated or more clever or more articulate or I have developed, this great theory. It's like, I mean, I've learned how to say it maybe in 3 or 4 different ways, but I've been saying the same thing from day one. And, it's taken me, if we took out the 2 years of COVID, it's taken me, let's say, 2 years to get people to listen. They're listening now, or they're hearing now, but still really very little change has happened. Now, that's how I look at it. And that's, I guess, why I keep banging on. Other people would say a lot of change has happened. And, in the 2 years that the campaign Can't Buy My Silence has been running, we have changed the law. Not enough of it, but we have changed the law. And actually, I'll put a positive spin on it because I can do one or the other. That's what I have known. Whichever situation I'm in, I can make it a negative or a positive spin. The positive spin is, we live in a democracy, and how incredible is it that I could get up from nowhere with no legal experience, no political experience, nothing behind me, nobody helping, and walk into Parliament and within a couple of years have a piece of law in place. And that's what democracy is about. Yes, it's hard work. But you know what? If you walk into Westminster and talk to your employees who are our MPs, which I hadn't actually realised until I walked into Westminster at 45 years old, which I am ashamed of, and I'm going to blame the school that we both went to for not having educated me about politics. But I didn't really get that. I didn't get that concept. I was so shocked when I went into Parliament or into Westminster. And the politicians are going, MPs are going, okay, yes, you want us to do this, this, and this. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, okay, right, we'll go off and try and do that. And, I'm making light of it, but actually, of course there are dreadful people who work in politics. There are dreadful people who work in every sector. But the majority of people who work in Westminster are there because they want to improve our society. They are public servants. They work for us. It is our responsibility to engage with them and tell them what to do. You can't be the CEO of a company and sit there going, God, my company is shit. Look at how shit all the employees are. Nobody's making any money. You just sit there complaining about it. And then the company collapses. Well, that's what we are. The MPs are our employees. And I think if we were a bit more, and obviously they don't want us to know that. They're like any employee. They prefer it that we left them alone. Actually, if you engage, it happens. And how incredible is that? We don't live in Iran. We don't live in, Russia. We can make change. And how unbelievably incredible is that? So the fact that in a 2-year period, between Julie and I, we've managed to change law in in England, Ireland, Canada, and it's changed in America. And that was done by Gretchen Carlson, who has a similar campaign to ours and is a great ally to ours called Lift Our Voices. Look at that. That's incredible. That can happen. That happens because we live in a democracy. So, there's a positive spin. I feel really privileged and lucky to live in a society that even with its political system broken, which ours is currently, it's still a democracy and it's still capable to make stuff happen.
Wow. That was I mean, I could keep talking to you forever and we will continue to have amazing conversations, but I think that is the perfect note on which to close things out. What a rousing call. That's phenomenal. Zelda, if people want to find out more about you, maybe they're in a position where they want some help because they're having an NDA forced on them, whatever, how can they find you?
Please come to our website. I've been very bad at campaigning on this because I haven't spoken about the campaign really. But can'tbuymysilence.com is our website. It is a huge resource. It has an enormous amount of information on what to do if you're being asked to sign an NDA, if you've already signed an NDA. It also has anonymous area to share your stories, and people who are silenced find that hugely cathartic and helpful. We've got over 100 stories there from different people, and we encourage people to share their stories. There's a petition. There's obviously a crowdfunder because we're basically completely self-funded, but mostly there's a lot of information that is very, very helpful. So please do go there and you can get in contact with me or Julie via the website too.
Amazing. I will put links to that in the show notes. I say this to a lot of guests. I say thank you for what you do. But in your case, I mean it more than anything else because I know you love saying it's not about what you've been through. But as we've heard, you've been through a heck of a lot. I'm just so impressed, amazed by the way you do it, what you're doing, the force of energy that you are. So I know you don't want to have all these compliments, but genuinely, I'm in complete awe of what you do. I want you to keep going. You are making the world a better place. So I want to say thank you on behalf of all the people and tons of people that you won't ever get to meet that you will have helped in some way, shape, or form. So thank you for all of that. But of course, the most important thing to say right now is thank you for being an incredible guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I'm sorry I banged on as I promised I would for an hour.
Loved it. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Zelda for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Zelda, her story and her campaign, Can't Buy My Silence, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating for it, please do so on whichever platform you're listening on. It really does help. And to discover episodes of the show that you've missed, visit the show's website, humanriskpodcast.com. As ever, if you've got any thoughts for me, things you want to let me know about the show, ideas for future guests, then do get in touch. I love hearing from you. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. I really hope Zelda's amazing story and her passion for changing the world can inspire you in some way, shape, or form. And thank you so much for listening.